In the vast tapestry of barbarism that was World War II, where horror seemed to know no bounds, there existed a place whose brutality defied even the logic of evil. Jasenovac, the concentration camp run by the Ustaše regime in Croatia, became an abyss of suffering so atrocious that even Nazi officials were horrified by what they witnessed. Unlike Auschwitz or Treblinka, where murder was meticulously organized with industrial precision, in Jasenovac, death was artisanal, sadistic, and personal. There were no mass gas chambers or protocols designed to optimize extermination with efficiency. Instead, prisoners were killed with knives, mallets, and saws in acts of uncontrolled violence that defied any human limit. But how is it possible for a regime allied with the Nazis to surpass its own creators in brutality? Why has the history of Jasenovac remained in the shadows, unlike other extermination camps? Ustaše, the regime that surpassed the Nazis in brutality. To understand the brutality of Jasenovac, it is necessary to know the regime that created it. The Ustaše movement emerged in the 1920s as an ultra-nationalist Croatian organization led by Ante Pavelić. Its ideology was based on ethnic hatred, religious fundamentalism, and the aspiration for an ethnically pure Croatia. For the Ustaše, the existence of Serbs, Jews, Roma, and political opponents within their borders was an obstacle that had to be eradicated by any means necessary. During the years leading up to World War II, the Ustaše operated as a terrorist group in exile, carrying out attacks and assassinations aimed at destabilizing the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. However, their opportunity to rise to power came in April 1941, when Axis forces invaded Yugoslavia. With the help of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, Pavelić was installed as the leader of the newly created independent state of Croatia. What followed was a regime of terror that quickly demonstrated its ruthless nature. Unlike other Axis puppet regimes, the Ustaše state was not merely a subordinate collaborative government in Berlin. The Nazis saw in the Ustaše a useful ally for maintaining control in the Balkans. But they soon realized that the violence of this regime exceeded even their own standards of brutality. While the Third Reich sought to exterminate its enemies through a systematic and bureaucratic process, the Ustaše applied genocide with uncontrolled sadism. One of the regime's first targets was the Serbian population. Considered historical enemies, the Serbs were marked for extermination or forced conversion to Catholicism. Unlike the Nazis, who saw extermination as a means to achieve their racial objectives, the Ustaše saw it as a sacred duty. This religious fanaticism turned persecution into a spectacle of unprecedented cruelty. The victims were not simply executed, they were tortured, mutilated, and killed in indescribable ways. The brutality of the Ustaše soon manifested in the creation of Jasenovac, a complex of concentration camps designed not only for extermination, but also for prolonged suffering. Unlike Auschwitz, where executions were efficient, in Jasenovac, death was a slow and merciless process. Guards were encouraged to compete for the highest number of killings in a single night, using improvised weapons such as special knives, hammers, and saws. Death was not quick, but meticulously cruel. The Nazis, despite their absolute disregard for human life, showed discomfort with the Ustaše methods. In reports sent to Berlin, German officials who visited Jasenovac described the situation as out of control, reporting acts of sadism so brutal that even SS soldiers were shocked. The problem for the Nazis was not the violence itself, but its chaotic nature and the disorder it generated. While Auschwitz or Treblinka followed a logic of systematic extermination in Jasenovac, violence was improvised and taken to the extreme of personal sadism. The Ustaše fanaticism was not only directed against the Serbs. The Jewish population in Croatia, numbering approximately 40,000, was almost completely annihilated in Jasenovac. The Roma communities were also exterminated with a brutality that surpassed even that of the Nazis in other parts of Europe. Communists, anti-fascists, and anyone who opposed the regime met the same fate. Jasenovac was not a labor camp disguised as an extermination center, like the Nazi camps. It was, from its conception, a place where torture and murder were the only functions. The hatred of the Ustaše was so deeply rooted that even in the last days of the war, when defeat was imminent, their cruelty did not diminish. While in other places the Nazis tried to destroy evidence and hide their crimes, in Jasenovac, the guards continued the executions until the last moment, with no attempt to hide their acts. The Ustaše regime left a trail of terror that still resonates in the history of the Balkans. Unlike Nazism, which was judged at Nuremberg and widely condemned around the world, the crimes of the Ustaše largely remained in the shadows. Many of its members managed to escape, some with the help of the Catholic Church, and the history of Jasenovac was buried in the post-war narrative. But the history of Jasenovac cannot be forgotten. It is a reminder that evil knows no borders and that, under the right conditions, any ideology can degenerate into a machinery of extermination. The brutality of the Ustaše regime and the nightmare of Jasenovac demonstrate that humanity, when it abandons reason and morality, can become its own worst enemy. Jasenovac, the man-made hell. Located on the banks of the Sava River in central Croatia, Jasenovac was not just a concentration camp. It lacked the efficiency of Auschwitz or the systematic nature of Treblinka. Here, death did not come through gas chambers or mass shootings designed to maximize the number of victims in the shortest time possible. In Jasenovac, murder was personal, carried out with knives, hammers, and saws in a spectacle of unimaginable sadism. It extended over a complex of smaller camps, each with a different purpose, from the classification of prisoners to their extermination. But in all of them, violence was the only constant. The complex, established in 1941 by the Ustaše regime, was divided into several subcamps, the most infamous being Camp 3C, reserved for systematic execution. The living conditions were indescribable: wooden barracks on marshy terrain, infested with rats and plagues, without access to drinking water or medical supplies. Hunger and disease decimated the prisoners, but death rarely came naturally. There were cases where Ustaše guards left rotten food inside the barracks just to watch the prisoners fight over a piece of worm-infested bread. But this was only the beginning. Unlike the Nazi camps, where murders followed an industrialized logic, in Jasenovac, death was an act of unrestrained cruelty. The guards did not settle for shooting their victims. They used improvised tools to prolong the suffering of the condemned. One of the most infamous methods was the use of the surpass, a glove with a curved blade attached to the palm, designed specifically to slit prisoners' throats quickly. In German intelligence archives, there is a report dated 1942 in which a Nazi officer described his visit to Jasenovac and recounted with horror how the Ustaše guards organized nightly competitions to see who could kill the most people with this device. It is known that a single guard managed to kill more than 1,000 victims in one night, a record celebrated with banquets and alcohol. The testimonies of the few survivors reveal terrifying details about the daily brutality in Jasenovac. A former prisoner recounted how a group of Jewish children was thrown alive into the fire of a boiler in the camp's brick factory while the guards laughed. Another survivor described how, instead of executing the prisoners immediately, they were made to form lines and given shovels to dig their own graves before being beaten to death. Those who did not die immediately were buried alive. Torture was not limited to physical violence. The Ustaše devised equally atrocious psychological methods, such as forcing mothers to choose which of their children would die first. The Nazis, despite being the architects of the Holocaust, began to see Jasenovac as a problem. In a report sent to Berlin in 1943, General Edmund Gleis von Horstenau, the Reich's representative in Croatia, warned that the Ustaše methods were counterproductive and that even the local population, terrified by the regime's brutality, was beginning to rebel. In another letter sent to Heinrich Himmler, The German ambassador in Zagreb suggested that the lack of control in Jasenovac could undermine the stability of the collaborative Croatian government. But nothing changed. For the Ustaše, terror was not a means, but an end in itself. In the post-war period, many of the documents about Jasenovac were destroyed by the Ustaše in their escape, and the lack of systematic records has made it difficult to estimate the exact number of victims. It is estimated that between 200,000 and 700,000 prisoners were killed in the camp, most of them Serbs, Jews, and Roma. The magnitude of the horror remains a subject of debate, but the testimonies and archives that survived are sufficient proof that Jasenovac was an aberration within the already macabre catalogue of World War II. The camp operated until April 1945, when, seeing the advance of the Red Army and Yugoslav partisans, the Ustaše attempted to eliminate all evidence of their crimes. They burned the barracks, destroyed documents, and executed the remaining prisoners in a final orgy of blood. However, around 100 prisoners managed to escape and testified to what they had experienced. Their testimony became one of the few windows into the hell of Jasenovac, a place where death was an art and torture a custom. Tools of death, execution methods in Jasenovac. In Jasenovac, death was not quick or systematic as in the Nazi camps where prisoners were herded into gas chambers. Here, each execution was an act of uncontrolled brutality, carried out with tools designed to cause the maximum suffering possible. The Ustaše guards not only killed but also enjoyed doing so. For them, violence was entertainment, a demonstration of absolute power over those they considered unworthy of existence. Among the most used tools was the surpass, a leather glove with a curved blade attached to the palm. Its design allowed for the quick slitting of victims' throats without physical effort. Documents recovered from the archives of the Yugoslav army reveal that this artifact was not improvised, but produced in factories under precise specifications. During post-war trials, a witness described how the guards organized nightly competitions to see who could kill the most prisoners in a single night with the surpass. On one occasion, a single guard, Petar Brzica, boasted of having killed 1,360 people in one night, earning the nickname King of the Cutthroats. But the surpass was not the only instrument of death. Hammers and mallets were used to crush the skulls of prisoners, often in groups, with the bodies piled in previously dug trenches. A German intelligence report dated 1942 described how the Ustaše took prisoners to the banks of the Sava River, tied their hands with wire, and then smashed their skulls with hammer blows before throwing them into the water. Saws were also a frequent method. Instead of shooting their victims, the guards often tied them up and proceeded to saw them alive, a practice documented in several survivor testimonies. A prisoner recounted how the Ustaše carried out these executions in front of other inmates as a warning. The screams of the condemned were accompanied by jeers and laughter from the executioners, who even bet on how long the victim would take to die. Mass drowning was another method of extermination. The Sava River, which ran alongside the camp, became a liquid grave for thousands of prisoners. Testimonies from the time recount how, in winter, the Ustaše made holes in the ice and threw the prisoners alive into the freezing water, leaving them to die in convulsions. On other occasions, the prisoners were tied in groups with barbed wire and thrown from boats, allowing the weight of the bodies to drag everyone to the bottom. Women and children were not exempt from these atrocities. Declassified documents in the archives of Belgrade include a testimony from a German officer who visited the camp in 1943 and was horrified to witness Ustaše guards taking small children by the legs and smashing them against the walls of the barracks. Others were thrown into the air and impaled with bayonets. A survivor recalled seeing a guard make a Serbian mother hold her baby while he forced her to choose whether to kill her child first or herself. When the woman refused to respond, the guard cut off her hands and then slit the child's throat in front of her. The killings were not just a matter of extermination, but a spectacle of sadism. In the testimonies of prisoners who managed to escape, it is described how the Ustaše enjoyed devising new forms of torture and execution. Often, prisoners were forced to kill their own barrack mates under the threat of even more cruel torture. On one documented occasion by a former guard captured after the war, a group of prisoners was ordered to dig a pit and then fight each other to the death. The survivors were finally executed by the guards themselves. The level of cruelty reached in Jasenovac even caused concern among some Nazi officials. In a letter sent to the High Command in Berlin, General Gleis von Horstenau warned that the Ustaše methods were not only unnecessarily brutal, but were generating rejection among the local population, who began to see the Nazis as a less cruel option. However, despite these warnings, the death machine of Jasenovac continued to operate without restrictions until the end of the war. When the Red Army and Yugoslav partisans advanced in 1945, the Ustaše attempted to erase the evidence of their crimes. They burned barracks, destroyed archives, and killed the prisoners who remained in the camp. However, some managed to escape and testify about what they had witnessed. Their accounts, along with the recovered documents, revealed the horror of an extermination camp where brutality knew no limits and death became an act of absolute perversion. Forgotten victims, who were destined for annihilation. Jasenovac did not distinguish between men, women, or children. For the Ustaše regime, all those who did not fit into their vision of an ethnically pure Croatia had to be exterminated. The camp became the final destination for tens of thousands of people whose only crime was belonging to an ethnic, religious, or ideological group that the regime considered an enemy. The Serbs were the majority of the victims. Since the creation of the independent state of Croatia in 1941, the Ustaše launched an extermination campaign against the Serbian population, which they considered invaders in their territory. Laws were implemented that stripped them of their rights. They were forced to wear distinctive badges, and finally, mass deportations to concentration camps began. Jasenovac became the epicenter of this genocide. Documents from the German High Command reported that the methods used to eliminate the Serbs in Jasenovac were so brutal that even Nazi soldiers were shocked to witness them. The Jews were another primary target of the regime. Although Nazi Germany imposed its own policy of Jewish extermination in Europe, the Ustaše did not need direct orders to carry out their own version of the Holocaust. Croatian Jews were persecuted from the first days of the regime and sent to Jasenovac in large numbers. While in Auschwitz, Jewish prisoners were killed in gas chambers, in Jasenovac death came with knives, saws, and hammer blows. Declassified archives show that the Jewish community in Croatia practically disappeared after the war, with an extermination rate exceeding 80%. The Roma, like in other Nazi-occupied territories, were considered a threat to the racial purity of the regime. In Jasenovac, the Romani population suffered systematic extermination. They were not only massacred, but also subjected to brutal experiments. Testimonies from survivors who managed to survive recount how camp doctors performed inhuman tests on them, including amputations without anesthesia and prolonged exposure to extreme conditions. Archives found after the war reveal that the Roma community in the region was practically annihilated, with tens of thousands of people killed in the camp. In addition to these groups, Jasenovac also served as a center for the elimination of political opponents. Anyone suspected of sympathizing with the Yugoslav partisans, communists, or any movement opposed to the regime was arrested and sent to the camp. Among the victims were intellectuals, Orthodox priests, and even former government officials who had opposed the Ustaše dictatorship. The brutality with which these prisoners were treated was especially severe, as they were considered traitors. But if there was a group that suffered extreme cruelty within Jasenovac, it was women and children. Serbian, Jewish, and Romani women were subjected to torture before being killed. Many were forced to perform hard labor in inhumane conditions until they died of exhaustion or disease. Others were subjected to systematic abuse by the camp guards. Testimonies collected after the liberation of the camp describe how some pregnant women were killed in particularly sadistic ways, with the Ustaše betting on how long they could resist before dying. Children, who in other Nazi concentration camps were often sent directly to death, suffered an even crueler fate in Jasenovac. Some were killed immediately, thrown against walls or decapitated with the surpass, while others were kept alive only to witness the brutality around them. In declassified documents from the Yugoslav government, An episode is described in which hundreds of children were forced to witness the execution of their mothers before being killed themselves. In one documented instance, the guards forced the children to fight each other with the promise of leaving the winner alive, only to execute them in the end. The number of victims in Jasenovac remains a subject of debate. While some initial post-war estimates spoke of 700,000 deaths, later studies reduced the figure to between 77,000 and 100,000, based on recovered records. However, many original documents were destroyed by the Ustaše before the fall of the camp, making precise accounting difficult. Reports from the Nazi era, Yugoslav intelligence archives, and survivor testimonies agree that the actual number could be significantly higher. The debate over the figures does not diminish the magnitude of the horror. Beyond the exact number, the extermination methods employed in Jasenovac place it among the most brutal concentration camps of World War II. In testimonies recorded after the war, the few survivors who managed to escape described the feeling of being trapped in a hell on earth, where death was not just a destiny, but a macabre spectacle for those who inflicted it. The crimes committed in Jasenovac remained in the shadows for decades, with deliberate efforts to minimize or distort the history. Archives found in recent years have shed new light on the magnitude of the extermination, and although the exact figures may still be a matter of discussion, what happened within those walls remains one of the darkest episodes in human history. When horror is too much, the Nazi reaction to Jasenovac. In the Nazi extermination machinery, death was systematic, calculated, and designed to be as efficient as possible. However, when German officials visited Jasenovac, they were shocked by the brutality with which the Ustaše carried out their killings. There were no gas chambers or a production line of death, as in Auschwitz or Treblinka. Instead, there was a display of uncontrolled violence, with methods so atrocious that even the Nazis themselves considered it excessive. One of the first reports that alerted German authorities to the nature of Jasenovac was sent by Hermann Neubacher, a high-ranking official of the Third Reich in the Balkans. In his writings to Berlin, he described the extreme cruelty of the Ustaše regime, noting that the killings were carried out with knives, hammers, and saws, and that they were often performed in macabre celebrations where guards competed to see who could kill the most prisoners in a single night. Neubacher warned that such atrocities were not only unnecessary from a military standpoint, but could generate resistance among the population and make it difficult to stabilize the occupied territories. Another key report came from General Edmund Glaise von Horstenau, the German representative in the independent state of Croatia. After visiting Jasenovac, he sent a detailed report to his superiors in which he described the camp as a disgrace to the Reich. He recounted scenes in which women and children were killed in cold blood, while the Ustaše guards laughed and bet on the number of victims they could execute in a day. In a letter to Berlin, he wrote that not even in the Middle Ages were such atrocities committed, warning that the brutality of the Ustaše far exceeded any other act committed on the Eastern Front. In August 1942, Artur Fleps, a general of the Waffen-SS, visited the camp and was horrified by what he saw. In his report, he expressed his consternation at the lack of organization and the level of unnecessary sadism. Unlike the Nazi camps, where the elimination of prisoners was carried out through an industrial system, in Jasenovac, the methods were primitive, chaotic, and bloody. Fleps argued that, although the final objective of the Ustaše coincided with that of the Reich in terms of ethnic cleansing, the way they carried it out was counterproductive and generated distrust among the population. The differences between the industrialization of the Nazi genocide and the uncontrolled sadism of Jasenovac were a cause for concern for the German hierarchy. While Hitler's regime sought to exterminate its enemies efficiently, with the least possible cost of resources, the Ustaše seemed to enjoy the violence, prolonging the suffering of their victims in extremely cruel ways. In Auschwitz, prisoners were transported by train, selected, and sent to the gas chambers in a matter of minutes. In Jasenovac, the executions were personal, carried out with bladed weapons, and with a level of brutality that even German soldiers found difficult to process. One of the most impactful episodes recorded by Nazi officials occurred during the so-called Night of Competitions, when camp guards organized a contest to see who could kill the most prisoners in a single shift. According to German documents recovered after the war, the guard Petar Brzezika used the surpass, a glove with a curved blade designed to slit prisoners' throats, and managed to kill more than 1,000 people in one night. His feat was celebrated by the Ustaše, who rewarded him with food and alcohol, while the Germans who witnessed the event were left stunned by the scene. The German ambassador in Zagreb, Siegfried Kasche, sent several reports to Berlin suggesting that the Ustaše regime's methods be moderated. In one of his communications, he mentioned that the acts of extreme violence were beginning to generate widespread resentment among the Serbian and Croatian populations, which could lead to increased support for the partisan resistance. Kasche warned that, although the policy of ethnic cleansing was aligned with the interests of the Reich, allowing the Ustaše to continue with their savage methods could backfire against Germany. But the reports and letters sent to Berlin had little impact on the policy of the Third Reich. Although some German officials were uncomfortable with the brutality of Jasenovac, Hitler and his high command considered that the autonomy of the Ustaše regime should be respected. As long as the independent state of Croatia remained a functional ally, complaints about its methods were not a priority. However, the reputation of the camp became a problem within the Nazi structure itself, with soldiers and officials returning from Croatia with disturbing accounts of what they had witnessed. Some members of the SS, accustomed to the systematic violence in German concentration camps, found that Jasenovac defied all logic. It was not just about exterminating political or racial enemies, but doing so with a sadism that exceeded any military purpose. While the Nazi camps sought to make genocide an efficient process, in Jasenovac, the killings seemed to respond more to a need for unlimited violence. The attempts by some Nazi officials to intervene in the camp's administration never materialized. With the collapse of the Axis in 1945, the priority of the Third Reich was no longer the moderation of its allies' methods, but survival in the face of the advance of the Allies and the Soviet Union. Jasenovac continued to operate until the last days of the war, with its guards executing prisoners until the last moment before fleeing. The documents left by German officials who visited Jasenovac provide clear testimony of what occurred there. In a war where mass extermination became a tool of the state, the Croatian concentration camp stood out even among the most experienced genocidal perpetrators for its level of brutality. What the Nazis considered a cold and systematic operation of elimination, the Ustaše turned into a spectacle of horror that is still difficult to comprehend today. The escape of the condemned, the final act of rebellion. In April 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled and partisan forces advanced relentlessly through Yugoslavia, the Jasenovac concentration camp became a scene of desperation and death. The Ustaše guards, aware that defeat was imminent, began to erase the evidence of their genocide. Documents were destroyed, barracks were burned, and prisoners were executed in a final orgy of blood. However, among the condemned, there was still a last spark of resistance. From early April, rumors of the camp's imminent evacuation spread among the prisoners. They knew that the arrival of the Red Army and partisan forces meant the end of the Ustaše regime. But they also understood that the guards would not allow anyone to remain alive to tell the story. In this climate of terror and urgency, a group of prisoners began to organize what would be the final act of rebellion in Jasenovac, a desperate escape. On April 22nd, with mass executions at their peak and flames consuming the camp's archives, approximately 600 prisoners mustered the courage to attempt the impossible. They had no weapons, no external support, and their bodies were weakened by hunger and torture. But they had something stronger than fear, the certainty that if they did not try, they would die anyway. The only option was to fight. The plan was simple and brutal. Taking advantage of the confusion caused by the camp's destruction, the prisoners would attack the guards with improvised tools, stones, pieces of wood, and any object they could use as a weapon. The barrier between them and freedom was a minefield, several watchtowers, and a heavily guarded barbed wire fence. They knew that most would not make it, but if some could escape, their testimony could reveal to the world what had happened in Jasenovac. At dawn, as the guards began to organize another round of executions, the prisoners attacked. They rushed en masse against their executioners, disarming some and striking others with a fury fueled by years of suffering. Chaos erupted in the camp. The machine guns from the towers opened fire indiscriminately, cutting through the air with bursts that massacred most of the escapees before they could reach the fence. Bodies fell one on top of the other, but some managed to advance, dodging the gunfire and throwing themselves over the barriers with the little strength they had left. Of the 600 who attempted to escape, only a few managed to cross the final barrier and disappear into the nearby forests. Among them was Ilya Ivanovich, who years later recounted how he hid in the marshes, surviving on roots and dirty water until he was found by partisans. Another survivor, Nikola Nikolic, remembered how he crawled among the corpses, pretending to be dead until night fell, and he could slip away from the camp. Their testimonies would be crucial in reconstructing the final days of Jasenovac. While the few survivors ran towards freedom, the camp sank into its final phase of destruction. The Ustaše, furious about the escape and terrified by the approaching enemy troops, intensified the executions. The remaining prisoners were ordered to dig enormous mass graves before being shot and thrown into them. The furnaces and pits burned without rest, and the flames that consumed the buildings could be seen from miles away. Secret archives found after the war reveal that, in the days following the escape, Ustaše officials wrote contradictory reports about what had happened. Some tried to minimize the number of escapees, while others exaggerated the figures to justify the brutality of the subsequent repression. However, the testimonies of the survivors and the evidence found after the camp's liberation confirmed that the rebellion had been real and that although most perished, some had survived to tell the story. When partisan troops finally reached Jasenovac, they found a landscape of horror. The camp's structures were in ruins. The bodies of the last executed prisoners still lay in the mass graves, and the stench of death permeated the air. What had once been an extermination center had become an open cemetery, a silent testimony to the barbarity that had occurred there. Subsequent investigations attempted to determine precisely how many had escaped on that April 22nd. The figures vary, but it is estimated that fewer than 100 did. Many died along the way, either from wounds, hunger, or executed by enemy patrols. Only a small fraction reached safe territory and recounted what they had experienced. Despite the escape not saving most of the prisoners, it marked a crucial moment in the history of Jasenovac. It was the final act of resistance within the camp, a desperate fight against oblivion. Those who managed to escape became key witnesses in the post-war trials, and their accounts helped build the historical record of the crimes committed in Jasenovac. The echoes of that uprising still resonate in the testimonies and documents that survived the attempt to erase history. Although most of those who participated in the escape were killed, their bravery was recorded in the accounts of those who escaped and in the reports of the executioners themselves, who, even in their eagerness to eliminate all evidence, could not entirely erase the traces of the resistance. Silence of the post-war era, Jasenovac in historical oblivion. When World War II ended, the horrors of the Nazi extermination camps became the focus of the Nuremberg trials and the collective international memory. Auschwitz, Treblinka, and other extermination centers were extensively documented and studied. However, Jasenovac, the largest concentration camp of the Ustaše regime in Croatia, remained in the background, caught in the political complexities of communist Yugoslavia under Josip Broz Tito and the ethnic tensions that continued to mark the region. After the camp's liberation in 1945, Yugoslav authorities conducted trials against some of those responsible for the genocide. Vjekoslav Luburic, one of the camp's main commanders, managed to escape to Spain, where he lived under a false identity until he was assassinated in 1969. Dinko Sakic, another leader of Jasenovac, also fled, taking refuge in Argentina, where he lived with impunity until his extradition and conviction in 1999. However, many of the Ustaše war criminals never faced justice, and the testimonies of the survivors were relegated to official archives. Tito's Yugoslavia adopted a policy of forced reconciliation, minimizing ethnic divisions in favor of a unified Yugoslav identity. In this context, the official narrative about Jasenovac was diluted into a broader discourse on the crimes of fascism, without particular emphasis on the suffering of the Serbs, Jews, Roma, and political opponents who were its primary victims. For decades, the communist regime preferred not to stir ethnic tensions between Croats and Serbs, avoiding excessive media attention on the crimes of the Ustaše. Secret archives declassified in recent decades reveal that, although Yugoslav authorities conducted investigations into Jasenovac, much of the documentation was stored without being disclosed. A report from the Yugoslav War Crimes Commission dated 1946 estimated that the number of victims in Jasenovac exceeded 700,000, a figure that generated controversy in the following years due to the lack of verifiable evidence. The debate over the exact number of deaths became politicized, used both to exaggerate and minimize the magnitude of the genocide. During the Cold War, the Holocaust and Nazi crimes were extensively investigated and documented by Western and Soviet powers, but the crimes committed in the Balkans received less attention. The judicial processes against the Nazis became a historical and media reference point, while the crimes of Jasenovac remained in the background, known mainly in the region, but without the same international resonance. It was only after the dissolution of Yugoslavia in the 1990s that Jasenovac returned to the public debate. During the Balkan Wars, the camp became a symbol used by different factions to justify their national narratives. While some sectors in Serbia used it as proof of the genocide suffered by their people in Croatia, there were attempts to minimize or deny the magnitude of the crimes committed there. Today, negationism and the manipulation of Jasenovac's memory continue to generate controversy. Various ultranationalist groups have attempted to relativize the facts, while historians and international organizations have worked to preserve historical truth. Declassified documents, survivor testimonies, and forensic investigations have allowed for a more accurate reconstruction of what occurred, although the exact figures remain a subject of debate. The Jasenovac Memorial, built on the site of the former camp, has become a point of remembrance, although its international recognition remains lesser compared to other Holocaust sites. Despite efforts to rescue the history of Jasenovac, the silence that enveloped it during the post-war era left a mark that still persists in the collective knowledge of World War II crimes. Opozdena spravedlnost. Saudi a odpovednost zločinku z Jasenovce po kolapsu nezavisleho statu Chorvatskovi v roce 1945 uprečli hlavni vůdči Ustašovku různými smery. Někteří se s pomocí tajných sítí dostali do Jižní Ameriky, zatímco jiní byli zajati a suzeni furt Jugoslavii. Spravedlnost však byla nerovnomerná a mnoho odpovědných za Jasenovac nikdy necelilo trestu úmernému jejich zločinům. V procesech organizovaných jugoslavskou vládou bylo několik důstojníků z Jasenovce odsouzeno. Ljubomilos, velitel tábora, byl zajat a popraven v roce 1948. Miroslav Filipovič, františkánský kněz, který se aktivně podílel na masových vraždách, byl také oběsen. Osud jiných byl však velmi odlišný. Vjekoslav Luburič, jeden z hlavních strůjců tábora, uprchl do Španělska, kde žil pod falešnou identitou až do své vraždy v roce 1979. Dinko Sakic uprchl do Argentiny a přestože tam žil verejně, nebyl vydán až do roku 1998, kdy byl konečně odsouzen na 20 let vězení. Odtajnené zpravodajské archivy odhalují, že někteří ustašovští zločinci byli v rámci studené války naverbováni západními mocnostmi. Dokumentace naznakuje, že bývalí členové chorvatského režimu spolupracovali se zpravodajskými službami, jako GSU, CIA a MI6, což jim umožnilo vyhnout se spravedlnosti. Navzdory snahám postavit vyniky před soud se mnozí strážci a úředníci z Jasenovce vrátili do společnosti bez. The Lessons of Jasenovac, Reflection on Human Evil. Unlike Auschwitz and Treblinka, Jasenovac did not have a prominent presence in Holocaust historiography. During the post-war era, the camp was overshadowed by the Yugoslav narrative, diluted into a general discourse on fascist crimes. Restricted access to archives and lack of international interest contributed to its relative invisibility in collective memory. The documents and testimonies collected show that the sadism in Jasenovac was not merely a reflection of Nazi atrocities, but a manifestation of boundless brutality. Unlike the industrialized extermination of the Nazis in Jasenovac, manual killings predominated, carried out with knives, hammers, and saws. Recognizing Jasenovac as one of the worst extermination camps of World War II is essential for understanding the magnitude of violence unleashed by ideological fanaticism. The documentation and accounts of the few survivors who managed to escape are the only direct testimony to a horror that for decades remained in the shadows of history. Jasenovac was a man-made hell, a place where brutality surpassed even the standards of cruelty imposed by the Nazis. Those responsible for this genocide did not always face justice, and the camp's memory was silenced for years, relegated to a secondary role compared to other concentration camps. The documents, testimonies, and secret archives that have come to light in recent decades have allowed for a reconstruction of the facts and given voice to the victims. However, attempts to deny or minimize what occurred persist, making it essential to keep the history of Jasenovac alive. The lesson it leaves is clear. When hatred and fanaticism know no bounds, barbarity can reach unimaginable levels.